This is Green Tide Rising, a podcast following the green wave movement in Latin America.
And how it's unveiling a blueprint for global reproductive freedom. I'm Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm Asha Dyer. Last episode, we were in the Dominican Republic, where anti-blackness, ableism, and xenophobia all intersected in the lives of women, girls, and people who can get pregnant, causing the Dominican diaspora 1,500 miles away to stand up for las tres cosales, knowing it's not enough.
This episode, we are in Brazil, known for Carnival and the huge Christ the Redeemer statue. In Brazil, abortion is allowed in 3 exceptions. But this summer, evangelical lawmakers were working to advance a bill that would make it illegal for victims of rape to seek abortions. With this new law, an abortion after rape would be considered homicide after 22 weeks gestation, facing more punishment than the rapists.
Isso em pauta, isso não vai avançar. E se avançar, nós vamos para o Supremo Tribunal Federal para derrubar na barra do tribunal em defesa da vida das mulheres, dos direitos.
I first met Rebeca when she sent me a message on social media asking for help.
Foi aí que eu decidi mandar uma mensagem despretensiosa e esperar qual seria a resposta. A mensagem dizia que eu tinha acabado de descobrir que eu estava grávida, né? E que eu não queria continuar. E que alguém disse que essa pessoa poderia me ajudar, né? E por incrível que pareça, quem me responde é a professora Debora Diniz.
I'm Debora Diniz. I'm Brazilian. I'm a researcher and activist on reproductive rights.
Debora Diniz has been working in the reproductive space since the 1990s. She's also a documentarian, anthropologist, law professor, and one of the founders of ANIS, a multidisciplinary, intersectional feminist advocacy organization. Debora was helping women who needed help.
She was pregnant in Brazil and she needed an abortion, but she didn't want to go to jail and she didn't want to die.
Today, Rebeca Mendes is a 36-year-old Brazilian woman living on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, Brazil. 6 years ago, Rebeca was scared.
That is how she herself framed the situation she was facing at the time. She was then a solo working mother of 2 young boys and a law student.
And Rebeca had never been in a situation like this.
Eu, numa família muito comum aqui no Brasil, sou filha de uma mãe solo e tenho um irmão mais novo. Éramos muito pobres e eu não tive acesso ao ensino universitário quando terminei a escola. E como muitas outras meninas, precisei trabalhar muito cedo.
9 million people in Brazil between the ages of 14 and 29 do not finish high school. Rebeca was lucky to finish, but not everyone does. Over 50% of men and boys never finish high school, simply because of the necessity to work. And among women and girls, about 25% drop out to work. But almost an equal amount drop out because of pregnancy.
Minha mãe era uma mulher muito evangélica, super fundamentalista, contra direitos humanos, contra o aborto. Então nós tínhamos uma relação muito conturbada por termos posicionamentos diferentes. Me casei cedo para fugir desse lar abusivo e logo engravidei do meu primeiro filho.
By the time Rebeca was 24, she was married and had her first child. It wasn't exactly how she pictured her future, but she was trying to escape her mother's abusive home, and marriage seemed like the only way out.
2 anos depois veio meu segundo filho e vivi uma maternidade muito solitária e dolorosa. Depois do segundo filho também eu decidi que não queria passar por essa experiência novamente e queria proporcionar uma vida diferente para os meus 2 filhos já nascidos.
Her marriage wasn't going well. She saw where the relationship was heading, and she knew she would eventually have to leave her husband.
Mesmo morando na mesma casa do pai dos meus filhos, ele sempre foi um pai ausente. E para mim sempre recaiu todo o trabalho do cuidado. Durante todo o nosso relacionamento, sempre me foi imposta a obrigação do nosso planejamento familiar. Então era apenas minha responsabilidade a contracepção. Lembro que eu me sentia muito mal com o contraceptivo que eu tomava, mas não tinha outra escolha e outras opções de métodos.
She felt trapped, and her husband thought she should stay at home and take care of anything in the realm of the domestic. But Rebeca wanted to continue her studies, so, secretly, she applied to a law school scholarship. Months later, in 2014, Rebeca got the good news. She received the scholarship, and she finally had to make that hard choice. Was she going to stay with her husband, who would never let her chase this dream? Or was she going to leave?
Trabalhar e estudar nunca foram uma opção para mim dentro do casamento. Então, quando eu consigo a bolsa de estudos, foi uma grande virada na minha vida. No ano seguinte, além de estudar, eu comecei a trabalhar também. Então, pela primeira vez na minha vida, eu não vivia em um lar abusivo e tinha uma perspectiva de um futuro melhor para mim e para os meus filhos.
At that time in October 2017, Rebeca was switching to a new birth control. Since she had her second child, Rebeca had been using the Depo-Provera shot, the injectable contraceptive method that you get every 3 months. When she was still married, her husband did not want to have a vasectomy. So, for 6 years, the Depo shot was her birth control method. But due to some side effects she was beginning to deal with, she wanted to change to an IUD.
No começo de 2017, eu decidi trocar de método contraceptivo e colocar um DIU. Eu achei que seria algo simples e fácil de se fazer, né? Porém, eu acabei me deparando com inúmeras barreiras, várias tentativas frustradas.
Rebeca went to her local public hospital to get the IUD. But before she could get the procedure, doctors told her that she first needed to get her period and then have some exams, and then she needed to get an ultrasound.
E no começo de novembro daquele ano, eu me descubro grávida.
During this small window, waiting for her exams and going through the loops of bureaucracy, Rebeca had sex with her then ex-husband. And after that one encounter, she got pregnant.
Eu estava na metade do curso de Direito e meu contrato de trabalho temporário estava prestes a terminar. Então, quando eu confirmo aquela gravidez, a primeira coisa que vem à minha cabeça era sobre o meu futuro e também o futuro dos meus filhos, né? E a partir daquela incerteza de futuro, a única certeza que eu tinha é de que aquela gestação não poderia continuar. Eu não sabia como fazer, né? Como iria fazer um aborto, né? Mesmo sendo feminista, o aborto nunca tinha sido uma questão na minha vida.
But even as this new situation presented itself, Rebeca knew continuing the pregnancy was just not an option.
A primeira coisa que eu fiz no dia seguinte ao saber da gestação foi iniciar uma longa pesquisa sobre como fazer um aborto. Me deparei com o mundo da clandestinidade e fiquei mais desesperada. As histórias de mulheres que se arriscam fazendo um aborto inseguro permeiam o imaginário de todas nós brasileiras.
Rebeca found out she was pregnant November 14th. She knew right away that she did not want to continue the pregnancy, and her ex-husband wasn't super enthusiastic about it either. So he began sending her phone numbers to contact and potential clinics to call. But abortion was and still is illegal under most circumstances, and Rebeca didn't qualify for the exceptions. She didn't know what was going to happen when she made those phone calls, and that scared her. According to the Brazilian Ministry of Health, every 2 days a Brazilian woman dies as a result of an unsafe abortion. Rebeca had heard the horror stories of women dying or being scammed out of a month's rent for fake misoprostol.
Parece loucura, mas quando a gente tá nessa situação, a gente acaba ficando muito paranoica, né? De um outro lado, eu tinha as opções na internet, que poderiam ser apenas golpistas. E do outro lado, tinha esses contatos telefônicos, onde me faltava coragem para ligar e perguntar.
She began to feel crazy and paranoid, like she was going to call those phone numbers and the police was going to answer and then show up at her house and arrest her. But then...
Até que eu percebi que um dos contatos telefônicos era também um contato de WhatsApp.
And you know it. One of those phone numbers she dialed was Debora Diniz.
Naquela primeira conversa com a Débora, eu falei sobre o que estava acontecendo comigo e a minha decisão de não continuar com aquela gravidez. E ela, por sua vez, me contou sobre o trabalho dela, né? Como, por exemplo, a ação no Supremo que pede a descriminalização do aborto até a 12ª semana. Conversamos bastante naquele momento e quando pergunto como ela poderia me ajudar, a resposta que eu recebo é de que poderíamos apresentar um pedido dentro daquela ação para que eu tivesse acesso a um aborto legal e seguro, mesmo não me enquadrando nos permissivos legais. Então, a partir daquele momento, encontro que eu tinha procurado, né? Que era uma opção que me tirava de todos os riscos que me aterrorizavam. Mesmo se o caminho do litígio não desse certo, Debora havia me dito que sair do país e ir até um país onde eu pudesse ter o direito ao aborto legal seria uma opção. Naquele momento eu queria resolver meu problema de uma maneira segura e não me importava se tivesse que, para isso, enfrentar a lei ou uma Suprema Corte.
And 10 days later, in a letter to the Brazilian Supreme Court, which she read out loud and posted to YouTube,
Meu nome é Rebeca, tenho 30 anos, sou mãe de 2 meninos, Thomas de 9
she asked the
anos,
Brazilian Supreme Court if they could authorize her to have an abortion. The action was drawn up by several feminist organizations, including Anis. They argued that the criminalization of abortion violates the fundamental rights guaranteed in the Constitution, such as dignity, freedom, and health.
And she was ready to take her case to the courts.
Rebeca was the first woman in Brazil to ask the state for permission to end a pregnancy. But time was ticking, and by the end of December, there was no response.
Ultimately, the Brazilian judicial system didn't respond to her demand in time, and she had a legal abortion in Colombia.
Justice Rose Weber, one of the 2 women who sat on Brazil's 11-member Supreme Court back then, denied her request on procedural grounds. But like Debora promised, Rebeca would be taken care of no matter what.
But her courage to share her own experience changed the public debate around abortion rights in Brazil.
This is Green Tide Rising. Stay with us. Hey, Monica.
Hey, Asha, and welcome, everyone, to episode 6 of Green Tide Rising. In this episode, we are in Brazil. And like Argentina, Brazil is one of the countries that is on the forefront of reproductive rights, but not because of any laws.
As we've seen in other countries where abortion is criminalized or severely restricted, it can have a far-reaching impact throughout a pregnant person's life. We'll be hearing more about this from our resident Green Wave expert and human rights lawyer, Ximena Casas, whose study tracking the trends and impact of abortion criminalization across Latin America and the Caribbean is a clear message about why abortion bans are dangerous for everyone.
The fear of criminal prosecution, both for the pregnant people and for the providers, and those who accompany this woman and people that wants to terminate their pregnancy, is a major barrier to access these essential healthcare services. We have found that the criminalization does not only include imprisonment, but also the path of reporting and prosecuting that has a long effect on the woman's life. It affects them in all areas of their life, in their personal life, in their family life, as a mother, as a worker, and as a part of the community.
She's talking about people like Rebeca. But on the flip side, the restrictive landscape can also lead to some really innovative methods. It's like a pressure cooker.
Back in the 80s, misoprostol was a popular medication for stomach ulcers.
Debora Diniz, Anis founder, feminist anthropologist, and researcher, again.
Brazilian women were the ones who discovered the use of misoprostol for abortions.
In the 80s, misoprostol was sold over the counter. It was as easy as purchasing Tylenol.
Brazil has a tradition of wide access to over-the-counter drugs and a strong presence of popular pharmacies at the community level. For many people, the most basic step when in need of healthcare was in the 80s and 90s, and it still is today to some extent, to go to the nearest drugstore and ask the pharmacists what they should take for what they need.
Originally, the pill was intended for folks dealing with ulcers, but that quickly changed.
women started to experiment with misoprostol to induce abortions. Community pharmacists played a role in helping define basic standards for abortion management, such as pairing misoprostol with painkillers and antibiotics, and keeping an eye out for signs of infection through symptoms like long-lasting heavy bleeding and fever.
It's not known who was the first woman or women, or maybe pharmacists, that figured out the double use for misoprostol, but it's commonly thought that Black and Indigenous Brazilian women in the northern region of Brazil figured out best practices.
The uptake of abortion pills in Brazil was not a doctor-centric process. It was truly led by ordinary women's needs, creativity, and agency. The discovery of the misoprostol is an element of the chapter of women seeking solutions by themselves to avoid being dependent on institutions and medical power.
That's because there's this huge class gap in Brazil, and in turn, that reveals some of the inequalities in the healthcare system throughout the region. This is something we've seen over and over again in each country's respective Green Wave movement. Rich Latinas, which often means white Latinas, they find ways to get reproductive care throughout Latin America. There's even a saying for it: las mujeres ricas abortan, las pobres se mueren, which means rich women, they can abort, but poor women, they die.
Before misoprostol, self-managed abortion was performed with extremely risky procedures, such as inserting sharp objects and hangers in the womb, drinking poison or a mixture of herbs. But it was always important to remember that the risky reality was common among poor Black and brown women. Wealthy women accessed abortion in their private doctor's offices with no risk, even got their abortions in France and the US. But since 1940, abortions are only legal in Brazilian cases of rape or risk to life. In 2012, a third but very limited exception in cases of fetal anencephaly was granted by the Supreme Court.
So Brazil has the 3 exceptions to abortion, but
El aborto es criminalizado.
this is Marina Coutinho. She's a lawyer and is a strategic litigation analyst who conducts research at ANIS. Yes, the same ANIS that Debora Diniz founded back in 1999. So today in Brazil, abortion is criminalized with up to 3 years in jail. And if you are a doctor caught providing an abortion, the sentence is up to 4 years. But Marina says the rules vary by how much money you have.
Porque las mujeres que tienen plata pueden acceder a servicios privados porque ellos existen. Tienes profesionales que hacen este servicio por mucha plata y no están preocupados que tú eres una abortista o lo que sea.
La criminalización de aborto es mercadológica para muchos profesionales que cobran muy caro por un procedimiento. Entonces, las personas que tienen dinero accesan los mejores servicios, ¿no? Entonces no están pasando por esas rutas de criminalización, sospecha y estigma.
This is Raquel Lustosa. She's a social scientist and is also a strategic litigation analyst, conducting research for ANIS. Raquel and Marina work together fighting for reproductive freedom throughout Brazil. Here is Marina again.
Y al mismo tiempo, tienen muchos profesionales ainda que hacen el procedimiento de una manera muy respetuosa, que cumple todos los protocolos, pero estos profesionales están siendo muy perseguidos en Brasil en el momento. Tenemos pocos servicios que están haciendo el aborto legal porque esto se crean muchas barreras para acceder al procedimiento, especialmente en caso de violencia sexual, porque cuando es riesgo de vida o inviabilidade de vida extrauterina, podem acceder em qualquer momento, pero em caso de violência sexual tem todo protocolo, não um protocolo, pero toda uma barreira que se cria em los servicios, em los profissionais para não hacer, e los profissionais têm muito medo de criminalização, de responsabilização.
And like we mentioned at the top of the episode, this year, over the summer, evangelical lawmakers have been working to advance a bill that, if passed, would treat the termination of a pregnancy after 22 weeks as homicide. The bill was proposed by conservative lawmakers and is currently headed for a vote in the lower house. It was kind of a shocking pendulum swing to the right, as just last year, feminists felt closer than ever to decriminalizing abortion in Brazil.
But just months ago, back in June, demonstrators gathered in front of Brazil's National Congress to protest the bill. They came bearing green bandanas and banners with the slogan, "A child is not a mother." This focus on young girls was purposeful, as critics of the bill have pointed out that most of the people who seek abortions late in pregnancy are usually children who have been victims of rape. And going through with this bill, it would punish the most vulnerable Brazilians. It would not prevent abortions, but it would potentially mean that convicted rapists could receive lesser jail sentences than their victims. So Brazilian girls are really vulnerable on many fronts. And not every girl understands or knows her rights.
Niñas y adolescentes que pasan por una situación de violencia muchas veces, entonces buscan servicios y debería ser legal acceder al derecho de aborto, y cuando llegan en sistema de salud y algún médico tiene suerte de encontrar un médico que entenda su caso, entenda la ley y esa interrupción del embarazo, cuando reportan a los consejos tutelares, estes que deberían proteger los niños y adolescentes e investigar dónde fue la violencia, acoger esses niños. Na verdade, muitas vezes são as pessoas que denunciam que não se trata de caso de aborto legal ou que a niña queria. Então, é muito delicado, não? Porque não há conceito sobre o que é esse risco de vida de niñas e adolescentes. Então, muitas mulheres acabam morrendo, mesmo tendo direito a acessar.
Conservative lawmakers who are proposing this bill have been dubbed, quote, the rape caucus by activists because they feel lawmakers are playing politics at the expense of women, girls, and people who can get pregnant, just to boost voter turnout and support from evangelical voters who today make up the majority of voters in Brazil.
Yo creo que la mayor cuestión es porque Brasil es un país muy católico y las religiones evangélicas es una comunidad que tem crescido muchísimo en Brasil nos últimos 20 anos, creio. Tem crescido muchísimo e tem muitas frentes diferentes, né? Pero sei que tem uma influência muito grande em las tomadas de decisões de los grandes poderes, especialmente no Congresso, porque temos muitas pessoas evangélicas, muitas pessoas de religiões que têm uma prática discriminatória e de cercear direitos em las políticas e tentam implementar suas crenças personales em las políticas em la vida de las outras pessoas. Então, hoje nosso Congresso tem uma influência religiosa muito grande.
But fortunately, even if this bill passes through the lower house, it would have to be signed by President Lula da Silva, who has called the bill insanity, rightly so. But still, this show of strength from conservatives in Congress about how far they are willing to go if they regain control is telling. And as someone who grew up conservative evangelical, I can tell you firsthand, they do not give up easily when they have a certain goal in mind, and they are organized. We've seen this in the United States, where they set their sights on overturning Roe v. Wade and won.
For now, there are still 3 exceptions in Brazil. But feminist organizers have been creating strategic litigation to counter the revolving door of political leaders progressing and threatening regression. So, since 2017, around the time that Rebeca Mendes had to cross borders to Colombia to get her abortion, Anís also helped file ADPF 44-2. Here is Marina from Anís again.
Es una acción constitucional para se descriminalizar el aborto en país hasta las 12 semanas de gestación. Entonces, es una acción propuesta en 2017 por un partido llamado PSOL, que es un partido social brasileño con los soporte de Diniz en la escrita de esta acción. Entonces, desde 2017, ella só fue pautada para julgamento en el año pasado. Entonces, año pasado, la ministra que era la relatora de la acción, que es Rosa Weber.
The same Rosa Weber that denied Rebeca's abortion.
Ella proferiu voto, que é voto favorável para a descriminalização do aborto no país. É voto belíssimo, muito bueno, que habla muitas e muitas páginas de justiça social, de como a lei não é eficaz para proibir a prática, pero genera muitas vulnerabilidades para as mulheres. É voto muito bueno, em que ella votou para a descriminalização do aborto. Pero depois, ella se aposentou, retired, and o julgamento está suspenso por ahora.
So, unfortunately, ADPF 442 is in limbo until the newest justice in charge takes up the vote. But that hasn't happened. Not yet.
Pero todo el debate público sobre eso es muy importante para que presionen o tribunal para que esto vuelta para el julgamento más rápido posible. Pero no sabemos cuándo esto va a acontecer, pero tenemos una esperanza muy grande de que esto sea el camino para que el aborto sea descriminalizado en el país.
But in the meantime, women do what they can. They self-manage their abortions with misoprostol or even travel beyond their nation's borders. Today, women in Brazil can travel south to Argentina, where abortion is now legal up to 14 weeks, which we talked about in episode 1. But back in 2017, Argentina only allowed the procedure in cases of rape or if the person's life was in danger. So Rebeca Mendes went to Colombia, where in 2017, termination of a pregnancy was permitted as a safeguard to a pregnant person's mental health. Here is Rebeca recalling that experience when she had to cross borders for reproductive care.
A experiência da clínica foi um caso à parte na minha vida, porque ali eu encontrei tudo que eu não conseguia acessar no meu país. Faria um aborto seguro e sairia dali com o método contraceptivo que eu tinha escolhido. Mas voltando um pouco na história, até a manhã do dia que tínhamos marcado para fazer o procedimento, eu ainda não tinha me preocupado de como seria o procedimento e nem nada disso. Eu estava tão nervosa e ansiosa por chegar ali, a partir da possibilidade real de fazer um aborto, que a questão de como seria feito ainda não tinha passado na minha cabeça. Além desses sentimentos que falei, eu adquiri uma confiança muito grande daquele grupo de mulheres que estavam me ajudando e que me fizeram chegar até ali. Que me permitiu o privilégio de me preocupar com o procedimento só no dia da consulta. Mas mesmo nesse dia, eu me senti acolhida, escutada e respeitada pela equipe que me atendeu da clínica. Foi uma sensação que eu nunca poderia ter imaginado.
After the procedure, abortion became a political issue for her. It was less a matter of morality and more a healthcare issue and a human right. Today, she feels lucky that Debora was on the other side of that WhatsApp number and that she wasn't forced into having another child or forced into having an unsafe abortion.
Today, Rebeca is a well-known abortion activist in Brazil through her organization Projeto Vivas and helps women with the resources needed for their reproductive care.
Projeto Vivas surge a partir dessa necessidade de tantas outras mulheres que precisam de um cuidado de aborto. Hoje somos uma organização que conecta quem precisa de um cuidado em aborto com os serviços de aborto legal dentro e fora do Brasil. Basicamente, o nosso trabalho é cuidar de inúmeras meninas e mulheres da mesma forma que Debora e as pesquisadoras da Diniz cuidaram de mim naquela época.
Crossing borders to access abortion care is about crossing borders to foster solidarity.
As Debora explains, being forced to cross a border to access care isn't just a physical or financial burden. It also speaks volumes about whether the state views you as a human being.
And for women and people who can become pregnant and travel to Argentina, this has only made the absurd of the legal restrictions and bodily autonomy more evident and absurd. On this one side of the border, if you need to terminate a pregnancy, you may have to to go to unsafe and costly methods while risking criminal charges, like going to jail. On the other side of the border, terminating a pregnancy is now finally recognized as a health need, one that merits dignified, respectful care, just like any other health need.
Rebeca's experience is similar to what many women and pregnant people are currently forced to do in the U.S., leaving states that are hostile to abortion rights and crossing borders into other states where abortion is protected to find the access and care that they need. But this moment of people being pissed off and enraged about this dehumanizing landscape, that is the foundation for movement building.
What we see now in the U.S. across the states, or in the border between U.S. and Mexico, or even between Brazil and Argentina, for example, is how women build resilience and connections to protect their lives and rights.
No matter what the law is in a country, people will always need abortions, and people will always find a way to get them. And in that process, some become activists and leaders, wanting to help others. Rebeca's experience is a powerful reminder of the impact one person's story can have when spoken out loud.
The stories that we hear about how ordinary women protect ordinary women in their life needs and rights are really amazing. In a different dimension is the repetition of what our ancestors did when pills were not available to abortion or when the methods were really unsafe. What we see is women connecting women to share solutions and care.
It's a ripple effect that can become a wave. When we come up against barriers, we find the innovative solutions, which can open up a world of opportunity to see progress on abortion rights and bodily autonomy.
It's as we heard in episode 4. It's all about flipping the arepa, right? Our resident Green Wave expert and feminist human rights lawyer and researcher, Ximena Casas, has talked about this in previous episodes. Go listen back if you need to. Ximena, can you talk about why it's important to fight for access to medication abortion and its documented positive effects when it's readily available?
According to the World Health Organization abortion guidelines, the combination of mifepristone and misoprostol is 95% effective to end unintended pregnancies that are 13 weeks or less. The abortion pill is becoming a way to provide women with access of the health care that they need. The telemedicine has been essential, and especially after the pandemic, to guarantee the access. We are seeing in countries where abortion pills are available that there is a reduction of maternal deaths, that early terminations of the pregnancy happen in the first trimester. This is a way to provide reproductive autonomy and empower women.
So if the World Health Organization has publicly declared the safety and positive impact of medication abortion, how are countries responding? And what's the responsibility of the U.S.? Because we are one of the few countries going in the opposite direction of global trends on abortion. But even before Roe v. Wade fell, the U.S. had 2 policies in place that decimated access to abortion funding overseas.
Yep, that's right. Well, the first is the Global Gag Rule, also known as the Mexico City Policy, which blocked US federal funding for non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, that provided abortion counseling or referrals, advocated to decriminalize abortion, or expanded abortion services. Now, that's been around since 1985. And the second is the Helms Amendment, which prohibits the use of any US foreign assistance funds for abortion as a method of family planning. And this one's been around since 1973. And although the global gag rule was rescinded by the Biden administration, if Trump wins this next election, it is likely that it will be reinstated. So, Ximena, can you break down the harmful impacts of a policy like Helms?
As a global superpower, the U.S. imposed the Helms Amendment, which was signed almost 50 years ago And in practice, the Helms Amendment has also been used to prohibit the use of federal funding for all abortions, even in the circumstances of rape, incest, or the risk to the life of the pregnant person. So now that you don't have the protections of Roe in the United States, other countries and activists, we are confused by what we are seeing that is happening in the U.S. So the U.S. is now aligned with other countries like Poland and is failing now to comply with these international human rights obligations and standards to ensure that pregnant people have access to abortion.
I feel we can't underscore enough that the fight for abortion access must be inclusive and advocate for people on the margins, as they are often the most impacted by bans, not only in the US, but globally. In this episode, we've discussed temporary border crossings for abortion care, but for permanent immigrants in a new country where abortion is illegal, the situation is quite different. Ximena, can you explain how abortion restrictions uniquely impact immigrants in these circumstances?
So imagine that you are in a country as an immigrant, or you are in a country where abortion is not legal. If you have the economic resources, you will be able to travel to another country to receive the services. But if you don't have the income, or because of your immigration status, you cannot leave the country, you will not be able to get access to that safe services. So you will be incarcerated in a country without any options. And that's why it may happen that you ended up with unsafe procedure, or you ended up with a forced motherhood, with unintended pregnancy. And when you create this, you are creating these discriminatory actions and policies that will affect more vulnerable people.
Okay, the United States is at an inflection point for the future of reproductive rights, and the upcoming election is going to determine a lot for immigrants, for abortion seekers, for everyone. What we know for sure is that the green wave is pointing us in the direction we need to go. And the United States should be paying attention.
In the last 30 years, there have been 60 countries that have liberalized abortion. And since 2018, the green wave in Latin America has brought these groundbreaking decisions and legislations to protect and advance on abortion rights. So I think it is time to see what we from the Global South have to offer.
Countries like Brazil and the United States may be considered global superpowers in the economic sense. It's definitely not because of their current abortion policies. In fact, banning abortion isn't just a politically driven public health crisis, it's also harmful to the economy. According to the Institute for Women's Policy Research, state economies face an estimated loss of $105 billion annually due to restrictions on reproductive care. Meanwhile, companies that advocate for abortion rights, they have lower employee turnover rates and higher consumer loyalty than companies who don't support abortion rights.
The data is clear. When you prioritize reproductive rights in your policies, everyone benefits. This is the time for the Global North to listen to voices of leadership from the Global South.
We've spent the first 6 episodes looking at various strategies and successes of the Green Wave in a number of different countries. And in episode 7, we're talking with some activists who've been building frameworks of support and care that exist beyond an institutional level, and how it's becoming crucial in the United States in a post-Roe era.
While we're doing the policy work that's happening, while we're doing the organizing work, it's we coming together as a community independently of what's going on outside and taking care of one another. It is the only way forward.
Join us next time on Green Tide Rising, where we will be holding a roundtable discussion with Green Wave leaders, including our very own Ximena Casas and other reproductive justice organizers and advocates, to get a look at the inner workings of the Green Wave, the many years it took to get where they are now, some of the badass actions these women have been undertaking, and of course, suggestions for what we can all do to bring the Green Wave to our shore. This episode was produced and written by Monica Morales Garcia.
Special thanks to Ximena Casas and Pipa Lucci for additional Brazilian Portuguese translation support.
Green Tide Rising is executive produced by Jess Jacobs and Leela Meadow-Connor, with associate producer Adi Biaringer.
And produced in partnership with Pod People.
Our theme music was composed by Andres Aspiri.
I'm your host, Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm your host and executive producer, Asha Dyer.
Join us again on Green Tide Rising. And in the meantime, head over to our YouTube channel to watch and share our accompanying video series, Entonces. Link in the show notes.
You can also find us on social media and see more about this episode on our website, greentiderising.com. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. Bye for now.
Adios.